Good morning and welcome everyone to the National Contaminated Land Officers Group, Part 2A at 25 events. I'm Anthony McNicol, Senior Public Protection Officer at the City of Stoke, Events Coordinator. I'm joined today by John Rhodes, Scientific Officer at the City of Lincoln, who'll be running the Q&A sessions. Give us a wave, John. Apologies to today's speakers for such a packed schedule. I'm unable to provide your bios. All I will say, we've assembled an extraordinary group of experienced and qualified speakers whose bios are available on the IES events page for you to look at your leisure. Today's event, unintentionally but aptly, follows the plot of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where we will be transporting you to Part 2A past, take a look at Part 2A present, and look what Part 2A future may look like. Whilst we can't guarantee you an epiphany as experienced by Ebenezer Scrooge, I'm sure like one of Dickens' other most famous characters, by the end of the day you'll all be asking for more. After we've explored Part 2A past, present and future, we'll hold a series of breakout group sessions this afternoon focusing on the question, is Part 2A fit for purpose? April 2000. I was young, free and single. Happy, happy days. I was in my second year of my environmental science degree at Staffordshire University alongside my good friend and now NCLOG committee member, Hal Sambrook. Please let us know in the chat what you were up to back in April 2000. We're really interested to see that. The #1 song in the UK charts was Never Be the Same Again by Melanie C, featuring Lisa Left Eye Lopez. And as a fortuitous coincidence, the #1 movie was Erin Brockovich, which charted the story of an American paralegal and environmental activist who was instrumental in building a case against a specific gas and electric company involving groundwater contamination in California in 1993. As this highlights, and as we all know, Part 2A wasn't the invention of contamination issues. We've known for decades prior. What Part 2A was the formal recognition of the issue, which gave local authorities a legal framework for identifying and remediating contaminated land. How we arrived at Part 2A will be discussed in following presentations. The instigation of Part 2A sparked gold rush fever at local authorities, with dedicated contaminated land officers being employed and equipment and software purchased back in the halcyon days when local authorities had money to spend. My predecessor even travelling to Denmark for software training, which is hard to imagine in these austere times. Part 2A also had an effect on the private sector, resulting in the expansion of geo-environmental departments, already established consultancies, and has partly led to the creation of dozens of new environmental consultancies dealing with the work generated via the planning regime. I don't want to preempt presentations and discussions that will follow, but I do think it's reasonable to say that Part 2A was momentous. And if you don't agree with that, please say so in the chat. Before our first session, we're going to run our second poll of the day. We've already had the oil barrel poll up. So if you can just take a moment to complete that, please. So is Part 2A fit for purpose? Simple one, yes or no. And please submit. And we will look at those results later. Wow, yeah, not going to discuss that now. So we're now going to transport you back to look at Part 2A past, and where better to start than our first presentation in the beginning, which is by Becks Norbury, Cheshire East Council, Sarah Hamill, West Dunbartonshire Council, and David Carr, Dacorum Borough Council. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody. As Anthony's already mentioned, we've split today into 3 distinct chunks, the first of which is Part 2A in the beginning. The aim of this session is to remind everyone how and why Part 2A started, because it provides vital context and perspective on where we find ourselves now. Also, many of us wouldn't have been working in this sector or involved at that time, And those that were are now old enough to need our memories jogged about what we ate for dinner yesterday, never mind 25 years ago. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll try and cover the main aspects. We'll no doubt miss things or not mention certain items, but hopefully we will cover the main points.
Hi, everybody. We've already had a little bit of a preview of how Part 2A came about, but I'll just recap really quickly here as well. And there's a timeline up on the slides for you to just track through. The initial concept was found a place in primary legislation in 1990. Its main aim being to provide land that posed unacceptable risks to human health and the environment, with a focus on addressing the legacy of past industrial activities. However, it took 10 years to be defined sufficiently to enable it to begin to be implemented. It prompted a huge recruitment push within local authorities for specialist contaminated land officers, or dedicated contaminated land officers in a lot of cases, and was supported by central government funding for the investigation or remediation of such land. And many local authorities also had an annual internal budget set aside for those initial investigations. An answer to a parliamentary question in January 2004. Excuse me, I'll just delete a pop-up email. Stated that since April 2000, approximately 43.9 million had been provided to regulators via the Contaminated Land Scheme run by central government. So you can get a feel for how much effort was being put in those early days. One of the first sort of landmark Part 2A cases in England was the Bawtry case, which could be argued put as the first significant break on Part 2A work, or at least the enthusiasm for it. In 2001, a coal tar pit was found in a back garden covered by wooden boards and a layer of soil. 40 plus homes on the former gasworks were on the gasworks site, and remediation was publicly funded. The site had been manufacturing coal gas since 1915, was nationalised in 1948 and privatised in 1986. The EA tried to recover £700,000 worth of costs, which were half of their costs, from Transco. They won at the High Court level, but the appeal by Transco was upheld in the House of Lords. This had significant implications by placing financial responsibility at the door of publicly funded regulators for the remediation of privately owned commercial sites, where part of its pollution history occurred during public ownership. More broadly than that site on its own, I suggest that it got LAs and probably the EA as well, wondering how many more loopholes in liability might appear beyond the existing exclusions and exemptions when it came to attributing liability, serving notices, and where necessary, recovering costs. So there are other dates on there that are of some relevance, which I won't go into now. But what I will do is pass over to Sarah, who's going to give you a bit of a Scottish perspective on the early days.
Yeah, so around this time, at this similar time to the Bawtry case, the first two sites were designated in Scotland, one of which was within our authority, and that's the Carr oil refinery. And I think everybody in Scotland that works in contaminated land seems to be involved in this site somewhere or another. The site, however, was further complicated, as was the added issue of whether it was a special site or not. And it took a further 3 years for this to be decided when the Scottish ministers decided it should be dual regulated, which isn't really what the legislation was meant for. But also adding to that, the further complication was that, yes, it was a site with oil as an issue, but it had multiple potential appropriate persons. And so, similar to the site above, progress stalled due to legal loopholes when determining liability. And not long after I started, we were submitted with numerous schedules of evidence from all the parties involved who had much deeper pockets than the local authority. And to this day, the Part 2 issues are ongoing, and we're still to move forward with that. However, we are currently working on a regeneration project under planning, which should deal with the issues, but that in itself is proving has its difficulties. But myself and SEPA, we've agreed a memorandum of understanding, so we are treating it as kind of a joint project rather than taking responsibility for our own bits. And but around this time as well, as this was all happening, there was also a need to revise the contaminated land regs in Scotland. to align with the Environment and Water Services Act in Scotland. And I would say it was up until this point that the UK was fairly aligned when dealing with land contamination. Slide, is it?
Okay, so as we move through the 2000s, we were seeing refinement in the tools available to establish thresholds of acceptable contamination. Clear UK was released in 2006, and many of us were using this in conjunction with the US's Rebecca and Risk to fully assess our conceptual models. 2006 also saw the regulations in England amended and new statutory guidance released.
And in 2005 in Scotland as well, there was more money available. Seems to be more money flying around anyway. And at this time, it wasn't really seen as a big issue. The money was allocated to 5 authorities. However, this does continue today with the Vacant Dirt Land Fund. And I do believe is actually probably a big factor on how different authorities are dealing with land contamination. And also, from the last one I was saying, but following on from the revised regulations, the statutory guidance was also revised to align with the regulations to clarify what could be deemed contaminated land with regards to the water environment. And at the same time, DEFRA published the Way Forward document, which was providing a technical review of the science in which SGVs and CLIA had been based on. The outputs from this promised some significant changes to the regime. But again, this is again where divergence started to happen, because Scotland took one approach on what to deal with and England opted for a different one. And at the same time as this, as well as all the things that were going on with the contaminated land, the Environment Damage Liability Directive was included. And that was to deal with one-off incidents that have caused damage since April 2009 to enable a rapid response. And it's different from Part 3 as it seeks to address a more systemic contamination from historical practices. And it was intended to be complementary to Part 3, but it just added a consideration for local authorities, the EA and SEPA. But we're going back to everything was going on and all the changes that were proposed. I think it was from around about the 2007 when we really started to see a decline in financial support for contaminated land. And but I wouldn't say the fallout from this was probably not felt until around about 2011. But as you can see from the timeline on the slide, the appetite and support at government level was over the years dropping.
And that kind of brought us up to 2012, where the updated contaminated land statutory guidance was provided, and it really represented the next major change in the Part 2A regime in England and Wales. It introduced some key features which have been really important. The most relevant of which we'll cover in our second presentation, which will occur after the break. Unfortunately, however, the 2012 statutory guidance was very closely followed in 2013 with the withdrawal of the central government funding. In December 2013, the government announced that the central scheme would close on the 1st of April 2014, with a small pot of money, £500,000, available for 3 years for the ongoing remediation and absolute emergency cases. So if you think that previous slide, there was something like £43.5 million spent over a 2 or 3 year period, and from the 1st of April it was just cut to £500,000. At that time, Howard Price, the Principal Policy Officer at the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, commented, "The move at a stroke effectively negates the statutory duty given to councils by Parliament." So 2012-2013 essentially set the foundations for where we currently find ourselves in England and Wales, at least. So just going to pop back over to Sarah again for some more Scottish perspective.
Yeah, I thought it was quite important for this presentation to kind of look back, and I remember back in 2009-10 we did a Part 2A conference in Scotland, and I found the old slides, and I just thought it was quite good at this stage not to go into anything really, just to reflect on all that was being discussed in 2010. Even with the removal of funding, there was still appetite to progress forward, and these were the things that were on the agenda, which we can come back to later. But I think you'll realise that some of them actually still are relevant today.
Okay, that's back to me, and we're just going to finish off this part of the presentation with a final slide summarising the history, really, of Part 2A, the key points. First thing, it took 10 years to go live, so I guess we should have realised subsequent development and improvements in the regime would be equally slow. At the time, there were resources available to enable implementation, money for staff and training, and even internal budgets to fund initial investigations. And in most cases, there were specialist and dedicated staff. There was an enthusiasm and a national profile. So the enthusiasm was accompanied, I think it's fair to say, in hindsight, with a fair bit of naivety within the profession to do meaningful environmental health work. And that was obviously supported by a local and a national profile. I guess the discipline at all levels, whether it's preliminary risk assessment through site investigation, all the way to remediation and verification, was immature. It was developing rapidly. And there were few legal precedents to test the decisions being made to assign liability for remediation costs to appropriate persons, or even decisions made to determine land as contaminated in the first place. So it soon became apparent that the framework for defining those things was going to be a big challenge and a concern for regulators as they sort of work through in those early stages. As I say, this is the last slide in this little presentation, but we'll pick up on where we are now when we return a bit later in the event. So if you can sort of keep those points in mind, it will be useful as a kind of marker in time. And now I'll be handing over to Ian from Walsall Metropolitan Borough Council, who will be presenting on a case study that demonstrates the complexities of Part 2A.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm just about to start to share a screen with you. Hopefully some slides that will prompt me about the things I need to talk about as we go forward with this. So, are we all comfortable? Can the
Yeah, I've got that. Thanks, Ian.
Can the managers can see that? Right, great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name's Ian Jarrett. I'm Principal Officer at Walsall Borough Council. I've been dealing with contaminated land amongst a lot of other duties for a significant number of years. Willenhall Gas Works was one of the things that came onto our radar as a result of our prioritisation exercise under the requirements under the regulations. We identified, by using only houses with gardens, school playing fields and allotments, we identified somewhere in the region of 1,500 coincidences of things we needed to look at. Willenhall Gas Works was in about the top 20 of that. We worked through those. We've dealt with, by investigation, most of the top few, and they've been ruled out or they've been dealt with, which left us with Willenhall Gas Works, and we started to look at that and thought, well, what are we going to do with it? And the question is, why is it on our list? Couple of aerial photographs, one to show what it was like when it was in operation, and one to show what it's like now, or at least what it was like in 2007 or 8, when we got into dealing with determination for this site. As you can see in the bottom there, we've got the railway that brought in the coal. That's been turned into the fire station. Not a particular issue with that because of the nature of the use. We've then got the retort houses and the buildings, the gasometers, and more importantly, what spread over time, the gasworks waste tip and the purification beds, which caused us a few issues and a few concerns. So if we look at that, the drawing on the right shows the area of land that was bought or consolidated by Walsall Council and its predecessors under the Housing Act to bring forward land under compulsory purchase to be used for provision of housing. Now, that leads us to some parts of the liability, which I'm sure will be covered by my colleagues from Wales, and the case about whether councils can be held responsible going back. I will talk about that a bit later on because it does affect what we do to some extent. We then looked at where these housing arrangements, the blue thing, sit over the gasworks activity. And that led us to believe that, well, we need to investigate this. The black squares are zones that we decided would be appropriate for dealing with the investigation. We started with this zone, which was principally the waste area and the purification tanks. We then moved on to other areas where there'd been waste, and we then did the bits that had been under the buildings. All of this gave us all sorts of information. We did some of this public open space, including the area where the gasometers were, but they were considered to be much less of a risk because they were in fact surfaced to a greater or lesser extent, and the opportunities for exposure to underground contaminants was very much reduced. So in picking all these zones and looking at them with our consultants, we did an area that was outside the actual gasworks footprint and profile, and we checked this to see whether the developers had in fact moved waste into this area when they were clearing the site. We then checked other areas a bit at a time and looked at all of those and came up with figures for what we'd got based on the information that was available from that testing and taking guidance from our consultants. Now, this piece, which was part of the development by the housing developer, was actually outside the gasworks profile and footprint, and was the other side of what was initially an open brook. That was culverted. We did some checks in this area and identified that, or was satisfied that waste had not been pushed outside the gasworks footprint, either into these areas up here or outside the boundary down here. We also concluded that this area, which was actually underneath the manager's house and the gasworks offices, was also not so much of a problem, although we did identify one small hotspot which was quite deeply buried of benzoate pyrene, which was conjectured as being the area where the gasworks manager and his household threw out their coal waste from their cinder fires at the time. So it led to a whole re-education of what it is that people did on these sites. Now, we get to the timeline, and this really was very, very long. 2005, we thought there might be an issue. It took us from 2005 to 2011 to get the final report from our consultants who'd done all the investigations and done the assessments and who had put all the information together. And that really was strung out by identifying who some of the landowners were. If I go back to the previous plan, all of this open space, which was designated as public open space, you might actually think was in the ownership of the local authority, but it isn't. It was vested in the local authority by the developer, apparently, to be used as public open space, with the local authority responsible for maintaining it, but the ownership stayed with the obscure companies that were formed as part of the ongoing breakup of that site as time went forward. We ended up having to get warrants to get onto that site. There was not a lot of cooperation to be able to go onto it, to be able to take samples. And indeed, after we'd done all the work, the landowners insisted that we took out all the boreholes that we'd put in to check for gas and groundwater contamination, and removed it and returned the site to its original public open space condition, which was really quite interesting in getting those removed and a guaranteed reinstatement. We did ultimately find an Environment Agency document that explained how we could do that and verify it, and that was acceptable to the landowner, but we had to do that. It took us then some 6 months to actually make a determination and decide what we were going to do. And that determination notice was eventually served in April 2012, just before the just before the revised guidance was issued. Now, we were criticised for that, and why didn't we wait for the revised guidance? And the answer to that was, the reason it had taken us so long between the final report and issuing the determination was because we'd been promised on a number of occasions that the government would be issuing the new guidance and different recommendations, and they kept saying, well, we're going to issue it, and we're going to issue it, and they didn't. We had got a report that said this site is capable and should be designated as contaminated land under Part 2A. We were clearly under pressure from local councillors, the landowners, local MPs and other people to deal with the report that we'd got. So a determination was issued. We'd also had to spend some time in deciding who we might issue that notice to. And ultimately that was done upon all the landowners, the developers couldn't use the gas boards and things like that. Those were taken out of the equation. We then entered into the period of consultation about serving the remediation notice. Now that was interesting in itself because there was a need to identify who those people would be. More of that as we go forward. When the remediation notice was served, the Class A parties immediately appealed to the Secretary of State. That was in the April 2015. Within about 3 to 4 weeks, we had information from PINS to say that there would be a public inquiry and that an appropriate and suitably technically qualified person had been appointed to run that as an inspector to run that appeal. And we didn't have any issues with that, although we've had problems with planning inquiries and people who've run public inquiries in the past. And then very quickly in July, the Secretary of State wrote to Walsall Council and said, we are not going to allow the inspector to make the decision on the appeal. We wish to have the inspector's report and consider it because of the concerns we have about the potential outcome on legislation, concerns for future impact on contaminated land policy, and concerns about the large number of residents involved. I should explain that this was a housing estate of some 90 households, so you can sort of exponentially gear that up to, 3 people per household or 4 people per household. You're talking about several hundred people who are affected by this. That inquiry started in December 2015 and ran in sitting for 2 weeks just about up to Christmas, where lots of evidence was presented by both parties. There were matters that came from that which the inspector wished to have addressed between the parties and information supplied. So the public inquiry did not actually generally close until the end of January, middle of February 2016. It then took the inspector 6 months to write his report. They told us they had written the report, but we didn't see it. That was then sent to the Secretary of State, or to DEFRA, as the case may be, for them to consider it and make the decision and issue the decision. That was not forthcoming really until early spring 2017. And it would have been longer if local MPs and others had not got involved and reminded the then government of their policy of giving decisions in a reasonable time, and certainly within 12 months. They then gave us the decision. We failed on our first round, and that was primarily that we had not carried out a sufficiently robust technical and scientific assessment of the contamination. And in many ways, I have to agree with that. But what was done at the time was what was done at the time, and we used the consultants that we used. More of that when we go forward into some of the learning points. Having received all of that, and that decision then saying that, well, if you can establish that SPOSH exists and you are satisfied that it is contaminated by repeating your investigation, you can, because you are now not saying that these people are 100% liable, therefore there are more people involved, then it falls to the local authority to be able to do the remediation and recover the costs. At that point, the local authority and our services decided to fully repeat the site investigation in a different way and having regard to new information on toxicology, new information on sampling techniques, new guidance in the 2012 guidance, not the 2006, new assessment methodology, and in a different way, and decide again whether or not that site was contaminated land. That ran. It took a long time to get the contractual things in place. We then had to visit and arrange to get into all of the gardens of those houses. We then sampled 86 of 90 rear gardens for that information. And in 2019, based on the outcome of that assessment, the determination notice was revoked, stating why we no longer believed it to be contaminated land. So, just to explain, our initial consultants, when we were making the decision, looked at all of the results we'd got from a range of gardens in different zones, and we'd got a site-specific assessment criteria, having used the then clear model and the other bits and pieces. We had got a value of 1.0 milligrams per kilogram as being a risk value. Bear in mind, this is for BAP, which was then at that time listed as a non-threshold contaminant. All the residential gardens exceeded that 1 milligram. Zone 5, the average across that was 5 milligrams. The other two were 10 milligrams and 38 milligrams. The 38 milligrams contained, as we were subsequently criticised for, 2 outliers, which were subsequently removed and brought that average down to around about 20 in that zone. And we had got reports from our consultants saying that the land was sufficiently polluted to be determined as Part 2A. Now, did Walsall Council understand that the way that that decision had been given, or that reference had been given from the consultant? Probably not. But nonetheless, we'd used a fairly reputable consultant. However, we didn't have choice in that. Local authorities at that time, and many of you may still have, local authorities at that time were under cost constraints, and in many cases had what was called a framework arrangement with a particular consultant or a particular contracting firm to provide services. Our service was part of engineering and transportation, not environmental. Engineering and transportation had framework contracts to supply goods and services with AECOM. We were then, as a service, required to use AECOM as our consultants because they had got the deal to provide the service. we would not have used them by choice. Nonetheless, they did the work and it appeared well, but they were criticised quite heavily at the inquiry for not carrying out an appropriate scientific assessment, which led to that bad advice to us about it being determined as Part 2A. The remediation notices, after a lot of toing and froing, with discussions with the people we believe were responsible, in a nutshell, were remove the soil from any soft landscaping or areas that could be returned to soft landscaping. So this is under patios, paved front gardens, under sheds that hadn't got a permanent foundation and things like that, but not under driveways or permanent access ways, which we said were covered. Now, the people we served the notice on argued that all of that was unreasonable. The inspector found that it wasn't, that it was reasonable. It was also argued that we had not considered the potential for exposure of the residents to the contaminants during the remediation works. Part of our remediation document required people to be made safe during that work, moved out into temporary accommodation, etc., because lots of services would have to be cut off while they did it. That was found to be wholly reasonable, and our remediation notice was found to be wholly reasonable by the inspector, and again was accepted by the Secretary of State. Now, in dealing who the appropriate persons were, Willenhall Town Gas Company came and went with nationalisation. They never had any insurance. They were not required to by law in the days when they operated. They were subsumed by the Gas Council and West Midlands Gas Board. They were dissolved in 48 in the Gas Act and disappeared, and things moved to British Gas. We know from recent case law and other case law that British Gas Limited and their successors could not be have been found not to be held liable for those historical events. So the gas companies went out of the frame. Walsall Council we actually put in the frame because they had acquired the sites with other land and put it all together. But they, we argued, sold it with knowledge to the developer, who had to clear the remains of the gasworks, so they could not say that they did not know it had been a gasworks, and that was upheld in the appeal. The Part B or Class B people were the house owners, freeholders of land and occupiers of land. Now, one of the very difficult complications was that the developer did not sell the houses to the householders. They sold a lot of these houses leasehold, and then those leaseholds have been sold on to a lot of other people, and in fact changed hands on several occasions during the whole escapade. We found we were dealing with multiple people all the time. Got very, very complicated. What we did find was that the builders who'd constructed the houses had the opportunity to deal with the contamination that was there and did not do so. And that was upheld by the appeal and by the inspector. Now, the appeal was allowed because Walsall had not followed guidance and carried out a scientific and technical assessment. Can't argue with that. It was right. The reports and the people who produced them, myself and others from our team, were examined in great detail in the witness box by Mr. Tromans. Equally, people called by the appellant were examined in great detail by Mr. Marucci. Two most eminent, I was Queen's Counsel at that time in the field, and they dealt with all of those questions. But the inspector found that we had not done that. But they also found that we had incorrectly apportioned liability, i.e. we'd not considered others. Now that has a really strong material impact on things that we did afterwards. And this relates to the primary firm had bought the whole of the land, and they had cleared the gasworks and prepared the land for development. They then sold a portion of that land to another house developer. That house developer we initially identified as a Class A person, but during the timeline that we were dealing with all this, that Class A person who had been subsumed some time before by another big conglomerate had disappeared and had gone from company's house. We looked at that, and after a lot of deliberation and a lot of legal advice, it was concluded that we should not seek to have them put back on company's house and company's register and hold them liable, because they'd got no asset and there was no point in doing so. So we didn't do that. Our advice, or the advice to us, was to make the primary person who had prepared the site responsible for the whole of the remediation. That was challenged in a number of ways at the appeal, and the inspector found that they were essentially 84% liable for the whole remediation, and that we were at fault for not considering others and not reducing their liability from 100% down. They had argued that they should only be 50% liable. In fact, they argued that they weren't liable at all, but they said 50%. The inspector found 84%. That has a real impact when we get further along. Now, good points that came from this: we had established the significant pollutant linkage. And more importantly, because the developer had cleared the gasworks and knew what the history of it was and had prepared the site for the development, the inspector agreed with us that the developers could be considered to have knowingly permitted that contamination to be on site and not have dealt with it. That's a very important point, I think, from this, that you need to look at what developers did at the time they acquired the site and what they knew about it. Now, the real learning points that come out of this, and I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, I think I'm okay. The real learning points that come out of this is that you must ensure that the scientific and technical assessment is more than adequate to demonstrate SPOSH before you make a determination. But more than just that, it's very important that that scientific and technical advice is defensible against alternative assessments, because there will be lots of challenges at any appeal that comes forward. If you're in the situation where you're serving the remediation notice essentially to regularise the position, and there is unlikely to be a hard challenge against liability or responsibility put against people for things they've got to do, I think that's possibly less important. But if it's going to be challenged, it's vitally important that you can defend that as a starting point, the building block of any appeal that you have to fight. Now, the other important thing is, regardless of whatever advice you get from your technical advisors, if you are going to go into a contested determination or a contested remediation requirement, do challenge the advice from your technical advisors and get a second opinion. Now, we tried to do that. However, our own authority got in our way. First off, it was, well, we've got the framework. Why aren't you happy with them? Second was, well, if you want to appoint these other people, they've got to meet all these contractual liabilities. And there was a big issue from our challenges from our legal people with the people we wanted to appoint about intellectual rights of carrying out the inspection or carrying out the secondary investigation and assessment, and or the question of confidentiality of the information that they had. That rumbled on for so long that eventually it was decided we can wait no longer. We have to Act. Therefore, we didn't get that second opinion. Now, if we'd had that second opinion, I think things would have been very different. But that's by the by. But do be careful of getting that second opinion. Now, the next thing that really comes out of this as a learning point is if there is a challenge against 100% liability, which you are seeking the responsible person to carry out the remediation, and that is overturned, making them not 100% liable. And in our case, we had a 16% orphan element. That meant that the local authority could not now force the responsible person to carry out the remediation. We had the legal obligation to do that ourselves and recover the cost. Now, given that where we were and the reason that the remediation notice had been quashed because of the non-scientific element, there was a decision made at that point, well, before we decide to do this work, we will have it reinvestigated, which we did. Now, that took us another, essentially, 18 months, 2 years to get that work done. We needed to get into the back garden of every house. We needed to get onto various pieces of land. We needed to obtain lots of consents, and they had to do the work. Now, that then, this reassessment in light of new toxicological information, new assessment methods, new versions of how you look at things, different opinions on the toxicological effects of BAP, etc., came back with using the standard tools, and I'm concerned about these phrases, and this is where we're always talking about opinions. The estimated, and I stress that, the estimated exposure against doses reported in scientific literature as being associated with health effects, a so-called, interesting terminology, a so-called toxicological assessment. Now, that said, it's, and this is the other bit, unlikely to represent SPOSH. Didn't say it didn't represent SPOSH, said it was unlikely. And the final line, the combined results has found the concentration of BAP do not represent an unacceptable risk when considered in the light of statutory guidance. Now, that then led the local authority to say, well, we've now got advice that this isn't or shouldn't be contaminated land. Point remains, and I'll show you this graph.
Apologies, we are a bit past time, so we can just get through the last few slides, please. Thank you.
This is the last slide.
Oh, thank you.
This shows that on that toxicological assessment, that the considered exposure levels fall here, and the assessment level where you would get into it likely to be SPOSH falls here. I won't go into the exact terms, you can't read. This is all in the reports that are available or should be available on our website. But clearly, there is an element of exposure to contamination, but the risk is not there. So, thank you for listening, but I'll leave you with this thought. Despite all of this, despite all of these assessments and the time we've spent, this does not alter the fact that if you go into some of those gardens and you take a turf out of the lawn, you will find gasworks waste within 4 inches of the surface. But we can't deal with it under Part 2A. I'll just leave you with that thought. Thank you for listening.
Wow, cliffhanger. We might pick that up, I think. Fascinating, Ian. I've heard the story before. I call the story the saga, whichever you want to call it. But yeah, absolutely fascinating. Yeah, we'll pick up a bit later. Thanks again, Ian. Our next presentation is by Donald Payne from Fife Council on suggestions for diversifying your Part 2A portfolio. Over to you, Donald. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Somebody can tell me if you can't see my slides. So thanks very much, Ian. I think you've set the scene quite strongly for what I'm about to say next. I want to start with this part of the statutory guidance right at the beginning, where it says that we should seek to bring damaged land back into beneficial use. This has always been a sticking point for us regulatory officers, and not helped by our expectation to deal with public health, perhaps, ahead of everything else. But in trying to achieve this, I want to start with the man on the left in this photograph, Kenny Bissett. He is my lead officer. He wrote our first strategy. He procured the first GIS that the council had ever seen, the maps to go with it, and prioritised our sites for inspection under Part 2A. He employed the rest of the team, that's us, and he set up a framework agreement with consultants to start the process of risk assessment on these sites, setting annual targets. So by the end of the third year, we'd done 10 intrusive investigations, and we had completed our first remedial project in 2004. Come the financial downturn, we were already on our 7th voluntary remedial project. This photograph, I know it doesn't particularly look at it like it, but it's a domestic front driveway. And what we subsequently found was, we knew that the houses had been built over a former gasworks, but we found a square brick-built tar tank contained within a circular stone castle base. So the brickworks on the right-hand side there, the curved stone on the left, and this extended underneath the house, which is underpinned by struts and girders to keep it up while we dug the waste out from underneath. The resident remained in the house during the works, and it got harder and harder to dig. We had to get a breaker in, we had to tank our stuff away. But by the conclusion of that job, we were able to return the house to its owner. When he found out how much the project had cost, he did say, "You've been cheaper buying me out and knocking the house down," which was in fact true, but that's not how we work. He'd recently lost his wife, and his house is his memories, it's his home, so that was our decision on that site. Having proved that we could do jobs like this, we weren't about to give up, and Kenny went to council committee and managed to get us ongoing capital funding. So the gasworks pictured there, the square stone house still stands. The interesting thing about this project is that there is no road access, so those barrels of tar that you can see in the bottom right of the photograph are on the tide line, that's seaweed. So we had some interesting material management efforts to get that job done satisfactorily. I don't feel very confident talking about the middle gasworks. I'll move on. This is my project. Slightly grainy picture, but in the foreground, under the railway embankment, there are a couple of square containers. Apparently, you could take your car down and help yourself to coal tar, and that is the exact location where tar began to ooze up through the driveway in the garden of that house, prompting our involvement there. I promise I'm not going to go on at great length about our resource sharing group. Suffice to say that we own and operate that drilling rig, and that doing the work ourselves, I mean, you could argue that officers should not be labouring, but when you handle the soil samples yourself, when you send them to the lab, when you interpret the results yourself, that has increased our confidence working as a team, our competence to do the job we're paid for, and our credibility, I think, as regulators. But one more thing just to mention about having equipment of our own is that when I saw Storm Eowyn on its way, I was able to grab the gas clams out of the cupboard, stick batteries in them, and get them deployed in time to collect the graph on the right there, which shows a strong correlation between the ground gases and the falling atmospheric pressure. So I'm just doing a short presentation here. I didn't want to take up too much time, but in terms of what we've achieved in Fife Council with the approach we've taken, the number of sites that we have found it was necessary to determine as contaminated land is 0. And you could say that that's evidence that Part 2A is broken, and I disagree. I think that the legislation is important to allow us to do our work, and how we choose to approach it is equally important. Following a typographic error many years ago, we always talk about assessing sites to the point of decision now. So the number of sites that we have now completed risk assessment on is 1,871. Cheers. And the number of voluntary remedial projects that we've completed using public money, some of it on private ground, and that is a decision that the council has taken, is now 20. So I see that as as evidence of success. This is where things maybe get a little controversial, and I do need to say that the opinions expressed here are my own and not necessarily those of my employer, but I think this could lead to a bit of discussion later on. We've already looked at the the issues for identifying Class A and Class B people. Kind of goes without saying that the original polluter cannot be perceived if they don't exist. I've written here, or if they are a multinational. That's not really what I mean, but I didn't want to put this down in writing. What I mean is that they are a large company that can afford better lawyers than the council. The developer is not Class A if they didn't import contaminated soil onto the site inadvertently, or if they broke no containment barrier that was preventing contamination from escaping on the site. When we come to Class B, the developer is not Class B if they no longer own the land. So the minute the house is sold, bingo, that gets rid of that problem. Or if they have rebranded, and I'm sure that situation will be familiar to a lot of people in this meeting. And the occupier is not Class B if they claim hardship, which is surely everybody. The example I gave of the widower on the gasworks site, nobody can find more money than their house is worth to remedy the problem. And so, in my opinion, in all 7 of those cases, it falls to the council to deal with the problem. So we have, as I've shown, taken that approach, and we now find ourselves in a position where we have a strong and experienced team, and in order to continue our work, our policy of continuous improvement, if you like, we're working closely with, for example, people in planning and building control, but also people in economic regeneration and the climate change and zero waste team. So in our latest iteration of our inspection strategy, we have a focus on natural capital. Certainly during lockdown, there was a big emphasis even on temporary greening and improving. We don't have a biodiversity net gain in Scotland, but it's still it's a good aspiration. Not so much wind turbines, but sites like the one pictured on the cover of our inspection strategy are suitable for solar photovoltaics. Lined up for them, and a personal interest of mine is shallow mine water geothermal, but that's for another talk. Our team is part of the Place Directorate, so we've got 20-minute neighbourhoods, we've got active travel, and the last point here is sustainability in everything we do, and I'm sure Neil will be happy to speak about that further after the break. So just to summarise, I think our strengths here in Fife, we have an experienced staff, an experienced team, and got off on a good footing and maintained a consistent approach. Weaknesses will be familiar to everybody, financial pressures, but also wider responsibilities. So our team has recently had environmental noise added to our portfolio, in addition to air quality and contaminated land. But opportunities for the team going forwards, like I've just mentioned, biodiversity. I like this word betterment. You can't always fix a problem. There's no such thing as a pristine site, and maybe that's not what we should be aiming for, but just making it suitable for use, like the guidance says. Public open green space, renewable energy, gap sites. The one I'm thinking of is not in Oxford Street, but it's in Cowdenbeath High Street, and it's not going to be built on, so we're making sure it's safe to be opened up as public open space instead of being behind terrace fencing. Challenges. So Ian quite clearly cited this in his talk before mine. Land ownership is surely the biggest problem we all face. I'm being a little bit disingenuous here. There's also issues around, or challenges around what I'm saying is perceived problems. So this is a reluctance to develop brownfield sites because developers don't feel that they really know how to deal with the problem or understand it well enough. And so they would much prefer to pick a nice greenfield site that they can just get on with. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we're all familiar with disingenuous developers who are cracking on against our better advice. So that's just a run through of how we've approached Part 2A in Fife, and there'll be questions before the break, I think. So I'm looking forward to hearing now from David Jones, Powys Council, on the same subjects, but in relation to actions of previous councils. Thank you.
Good morning. Can everybody, is that visible to everyone now?
Yeah, we've got that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Okay. As stated, my talk is about Part 2A liabilities, the actions of previous councils, and specifically relates to a legal action against Powys County Council, who I work for, by Hardwick Price. It's some 10 years ago, I think, since this case took place. Sorry for it being a rather wordy, or is a very wordy presentation. It's a dry case, and it's a dry presentation, I guess. This is a site in question, Rosfollow landfill site. The picture just shows a leachate treatment plant that was installed on the land, and the landfill is actually behind it. The only thing to note there really is that the treatment plant is actually offset to the landfill, so it's not actually right on top of it. Some historical context. Powys took responsibility for approximately 50 former landfill sites, with most of those coming about in terms of the assumed responsibility from 1994, when the vast majority of landfills, and this would be nationally, I guess, closed because there was a change in waste management regulations, and in effect, landowners who had landfills could just hand back their consents. They were landfill consents, I think, at that time, and that meant that local authorities then picked up the tab for all these sites. Around half of those sites that we took responsibility for were privately owned, and our waste services department undertook the management of those sites for many years, up until around 2012, I think. Okay, they perhaps rightly believed that the responsibility for the landfills fell to the local authority, and bearing in mind that was prior to the introduction of Part 2A in Wales in 2001. And they also made a decision that the highest risk sites, as they perceived, I'm not saying that they were incorrect, they probably were correct, that they installed leachate treatment plants on those sites. Now, the plants that were installed were introduced in order to deal with a current problem rather than being long-term solutions. So they were rather Heath Robinson constructions, and in effect, almost from when they were installed, they started a very slow but progressive rate of decline. And as such, as the years went by, the cost of maintenance of the plants greatly increased, and eventually it was deemed that the sites would be better managed by my department, the Contaminated Land team, as part of environmental health. Now, in terms of Rossfollow itself, this was also a privately owned site, and Becks Council deposited waste from 1969-93 under a licence with payments to the landowner, not just through that period, but those payments continued really up until the point whereby we exited the site. From 2001, we took out a tenancy agreement to install a leachate treatment plant, and that operated under a discharge consent which was issued from NRW, or they would have been Environment Agency Wales at that time. Through that period, we significantly invested in the site, not just in terms of the maintenance of the plant, but in terms of building new infrastructure like drainage works all around the landowner's land, and restoring the land as well, to so that they could use it for agricultural use. And it's worth noting that requirement wasn't specified as part of the consent. I mean, the waste management regs changed that requirement on landfills. So whilst that treatment plant operated in accordance with its discharge consent generally, the plant was struggling to cope, as were, I think we had 5 treatment plants running at different sites, and they were all getting into the same kind of rundown condition. So we started thinking about how we could deal with that, and we started looking at the cost of building new plants, and we got an estimate of £1 million plus for one site. And then, of course, when we started timesing that by 5, the cost just became unsustainable. So I kind of started pondering a different approach to how we might be able to deal with the sites. And another CLO in a different Welsh authority made me aware of a site that they've been dealing with under Part 2A, and there were some complicated land ownership issues, successor issues to do with that local authority, and they gave me sight of some QC advice they had, which considered that the Bowtree National Grid Transco versus Environment Agency case, that ruling might apply to the local authority. They chose not to pursue that for reasons, there's not much point going into that now. That made me go and get our own QC advice. That was Stephen Truman's, who's already been mentioned, I think. And he advised that he thought that, yep, it certainly did. So we took that advice and had made a decision that we would then begin an exit from our several leachate treatment plants and the landfills. And on three of them, we exited with various consultations, surrendered consents. That was fine. But on Rossfollow, when we consulted with NRW, with our legal position, we got some contradictory advice. And we kind of ended up in a situation whereby we had their contaminated land and groundwater team telling us that they thought the site was low risk. It was in a low sensitivity area. And as such, they had ended their monitoring at the site several years previously. And in fact, we were kind of given a green light that provided we went down the former routes of surrendering, there wouldn't be an issue. However, when we did try to surrender the consent, their NRW's environment officer teams, who, as you'll know, deal a lot with site incidents, pollution incidents, and a bit of permitting, I guess. They visited the site and effectively tried to make us upgrade or effectively replace the plant, and we got into a very protracted, let's call it, discussion with them. And even though we ended up trying to explain our legal position, and particularly when we started trying to talk about Part 2A, they didn't want to know. And I think it was a combination of not understanding what Part 2A was, and that certainly came across to us, but also just only wanting to talk about a discharge consent. Anyway, we had committed to our course of action. NRW did allow us to surrender that consent, telling us that there was nothing legally they could do to stop us. And we also then advised the landowner of the legal position, and we ended our interest at the landfill roundabout by 2015. On the other sites, though, we had done the same. There was the consultations with the landowners went nowhere. They pretty much didn't comment. However, on this site, the landowner decided to challenge us. One of the only pictures I got, or the second one, is David versus Goliath. The reason I put that in there is because we went, the legal case was heard in the High Court, and it became very apparent that Powys were portrayed by their legal team as being the big bad bully boy, shirking our responsibilities. And despite any attempts to outline the extent of the financial input that we had made and the payments to the landowner, that was all ignored by the court. And that kind of set the tone for the whole proceedings. So it's important to note that Rossfollow had never been determined as contaminated land or inspected, and so there's no requirement to undertake any remediation, and that to me always made this case both interesting and baffling, to be honest. The action by the landowner was to clarify the liabilities in the event that the land was determined in the future, with the landowner seeking declaratory relief from the High Court that they were not an appropriate person and that Powys were. Now, this is one of the key aspects here, is that Powys was created by the Local Government Wales Act in 1994, which abolished the 3 district councils, excuse me for coughing, in 1996. Our QC argued that the transfer of liabilities under the Act did not extend to future liabilities imposed by the future Part 2A legislation. Now, one of the key elements that the High Court judge used, and it's worth saying that certainly in our case, and I think it often is the case, that the High Court is just one judge acting alone. The judge used one sample that the NRW took, the environment officers took on their visit to the site, whereby, what did I go here somewhere, whereby the judge made much of that one water sample and stated that, and this is quote what NRW said, that it appeared that the discharge from the treatment plant was having a detrimental effect. Now, what was rather apparent from that statement was that there was no reference to anything about Part 2A, so nothing about SPOSH or the statutory inspection process whatsoever. And the judge made big store of that. And so we obviously lost that case in the High Court, with the judge saying there's a real and substantial risk that the site will be found to be contaminated land in the foreseeable future. Again, any reference to the former statutory regime, inspection regime, which clearly hadn't taken place, wasn't there. The judge went on to say the public should be able to look to Powys precisely in respect to those matters which it would look to the predecessor Brecknockshire Council, and should be in no worse position as a result of that local government reorganisation. And it's worth saying that the local government reorganisation legislation effectively meant that what went before with the previous district councils would then transfer to the new council, to Powys Council. The judge also then said in ruling against us that the declaration that Powys is an appropriate person would not prejudice any determination, but such a declaration will make clear to the parties that the applicants are not solely at least responsible for potential liabilities. We went away, licked our wounds, reconsulted with the QC, and the QC just basically advised that the High Court was fundamentally wrong and that we would have a fairly good chance of winning. So we did go to appeal, and in the High Court, the judge distinguished the Bowdry National Grid case on the basis that the case concerned a company and not a public authority. But it was also noteworthy that the House of Lords ruling on the Bowdry case stated in effect that there was nothing in Part 2A that distinguished the difference between public or private polluters, and that formed the basis of our defence, that there'd have to be careful statutory language needed to transfer the liability, which obviously didn't exist in respect of the land which its successor had never owned or had any interest in. So in effect, the ruling could apply to a public as well as a private organisation. We also argued that the decision could have significant implications for other local authorities in Wales, as they could become liable for remediation of sites they didn't know they were liable for. We had a unanimous decision. If you don't know, the Court of Appeal is at least 3 judges. They ruled the council not responsible for potential liabilities under legislation that was created after the local government reorganisation. And it ruled that Part 2A could not be applied retrospectively to authorities established before that time. It also confirmed that we weren't a responsible person because it wasn't in effect at the time the local authorities were abolished and that Powys was established. And so that was, you know, obviously I hesitate to use the word victory, but I guess that's kind of how it was viewed. That wasn't quite the end of it, and the landowners continued to try to challenge to go to the Supreme Court. That was rejected. And then we had a situation with their solicitor threatening to go to the European Court of Human Rights, and that didn't materialize. So the conclusions that I've kind of drawn, or just some of them, I suppose, and this is my last slide, is that the landowner took advice from a solicitor who had no understanding of Part 2A, and they worked on a no-win, no-fee contract. And that really drove everything. The solicitor was extremely aggressive with us, refused to listen to anything that we tried to offer in terms of we were trying to offer transfer of the plant, for example, and some other things, but we just got nowhere with that. I think the thing which still shocks me to this day is that the interpretation of Part 2A during the High Court case was radically different to my working knowledge of Part 2A, and I had done several statutory inspections over the years, so you know it was as tuned as any CLO, I guess, at that time. And that the arguments that we put forward in terms of the statutory inspection process was completely lost. It was like the judge just wasn't interested at all. Interestingly, after that case, and the landowner did face costs from us for all our legal costs, they revealed to us that they weren't really bothered about taking it through the courts, with a hint that it was about the solicitor kept pushing the no-win, no-fee aspects of it. And all they really wanted to know was that the drainage system, which Powys had paid a few £100,000 to have installed, that we would continue to maintain it. And that was all he was really interested in. And it's also worth noting that, as far as I know, no other Welsh authorities have acted on this ruling, because, and I'm assuming that's because many CLOs don't manage landfills. So thanks very much for listening, and obviously the questions come later.
Brilliant, David. Another incredibly challenging set of circumstances and sites. Wow.